Okay, now we're starting. All right, now we're starting the fourth session, a multiplex approach to the human self and action, contemporary interpretation of multiplex approaches. So thank you very much for coming to our afternoon session. I hope you all had a nice lunch and prayer. So I want to start from training. So the first presenter will be Professor Recep Şentürk. I think everyone knows Professor Recep, but should I introduce himself? Well, he's my sensei, he's my hoja. Now, Professor Recep Şentürk holds a PhD from Columbia University, Department of Sociology, and he specialized in civilization studies and sociology of knowledge in human rights and Islamic studies. Especially his PhD's work is like a sociological analysis of the Hadith network. Today his talk is, the even title looks really interesting, Me, Myself, and I, Ghazali's theory of multiplex self and action. Tamam, Professor Recep.
Thank you very much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I will be talking about me, myself, and I. So it's plural. And I have problem with the computer. It always autocorrects. I write myself, it says myself. To reflect the maratibul nafs, I always I wanted to use myself, in plural, because we don't have like a fixed self. Self is open to change, improve. So in order to reflect this, I use the plural, myself and I. So I is the object, the actor, and me is the maf'ul, subject. I am both fa'il and maf'ul, but I am the fa'il, I am the maf'ul. So I act upon myself, and through this action, I change myself. I move from one self to another self, to another self. So I don't have a given and fixed self. Through my own action upon myself, I make myself change myself to another self. So at one point in life, I have a self. Then I change this self, make another self, then another self, then another self. Go through marahil, as Sheikh Amin said. And I will rely on Imam Ghazali's theory of multiplex self and action while trying to explain this. And in this presentation, I will talk about human being as both the subject and the object on himself, and an alternative ontological approach to beings from Ghazali, and Ghazali's conception of human being and the self, or the selves, for the same human being, for the same person, the self in modern social sciences, and the implications of Ghazali approach to multiplex self on social inquiry. So why human beings are both the subject and the object? Why did Allah Ta'ala create us the same way? He made us self-reflexive creatures who can act upon themselves with the potential of transforming themselves. And we are not pre-programmed. Like animals, they are pre-programmed. When they are born, they know what to do. And then, they stand up, walk, find their food, do whatever they are required to do. But when it comes to human beings, we have to be taught. We have to learn. So our creation is kind of under-programmed, but animals, they are programmed. And Ibn Khaldun calls this animals, their life is ilhami. Ilhami. I like this word much better than instinctive, or pre-programmed. So Allah gives ilham to them when they are born, and they live their life like this. But human life is iradi. So this gap in the programming must be done by ourselves. Like we have to program ourselves, you know, like the computer comes with the hardware, you have to install all the softwares that you want to use there. So we are, you know, very roughly comparable to this. We have to install irade and move in this direction. And why are we so? This is the hikmah of Allah Ta'ala, that we are given free choice to complete this under-programmed section using our free will and irada, which deserves to be rewarded or punished. So this lack of complete programming makes us superior rather than less superior to other creatures. So Ghazali says that in the world there are two kinds of creatures. One, you know, complete, the other incomplete. Okay, so like in the animal kingdom, what it is what ought to be, you know, same. But in the human kingdom, what it is not what it ought to be. This ought to be is missing. So human kingdom is incomplete, and it requires human effort, you know, to get to this ought to be level through our own efforts. And Ghazali calls this tekmil, and even the sheikh is called mukammil, you know, the one who teaches you tekmil, how you reach to this kamal by completing this missing part through education. So according to Ghazali, we have material world, mulk, and then non-material world, malakut, and the divine world, lahut. And Imam Rabbani as-Sirhindi says human beings are jami', in the sense that we are connected to whole existence. We are connected to Allah Ta'ala, we are connected to Alim al-Ghayb, we are connected to the material world. There is nothing in the world we are not connected, al-jami'. And he says this quality is a source of distraction. You know, if your alaqat, as it's mentioned in previous presentation, you know, in these alaqat, if you see them in themselves, you get distracted. But if you see those things as signs of Allah Ta'ala, as tajalli af'ali, tajalli sifati, manifestations of God's actions and attributions, they all lead you to Allah Ta'ala. So this jami'ness turn into a source of usul ila Allah Ta'ala. So he says that we have body, mind, and soul. And usually soul and mind, they are conflated. And they are treated as one single category, which is not acceptable from the Islamic and Ghazali perspective. Mind is a function of brain. And mind is a tool of the soul, of the heart, through which the intentions and the will is communicated to the body, and also bodily needs are communicated to the soul. So the intermediary between soul and the body, this is the mind. And in the soul, there's a dialectic, unresolvable dialectic, you know, kind of, between reason and the hedonistic self, nafs, aql and nafs. Their relationship, their alaka, determines who you are. And this, I try to illustrate this in these three types of self, you know, an-nafs al-ammara, an-nafs al-lawwama, and an-nafs al-mutmainna. These are the selves. that we may potentially have. So depending on our choice, we may have type 1 self, or type 2 self, or type 3 self. You know, we are not programmed to have any of them. It's our will, you know. So these are my cells, and I am free to choose either one. I may choose nafs ammara and make my hedonistic self, you know, my nafs al-ammara, the ruler. Ammara means the one who rules, giving amr, ammara. So whether you make an-nafs al-ammara or al-aql al-ammara, you know, which one rules? You know, your aql or your nafs? In the type 1 self, hedonistic self is dominant, and reason is subjugated to its orders. And this is the most common thing in the world. And social scientists, because they observe statistically, you know, they look at the majority have nafs ammara, and they think this is human nature. You know, so modern social sciences or postmodern social sciences, they take nafs ammara as given, and they assume this is human nature. But we argue otherwise. No, this is not human nature. Nafs mutma'inna is human nature. Type 3 self is real human nature, and social systems, economy, politics, education, psychology, they are all built upon this wrong assumption that nafs ammara is human nature. You know, this is in modern civilization, and modern civilization may be called civilization of nafs al-ammara, because they assume this is human nature, and they build everything on this. But Ghazali says, and actually this is like what Imam Rabbani as-Sirhindi also uses the same term, siyasatul qalb, or as-siyasa al-qalbiyya. You know, these conflicting powers inside of us must be governed. And hukama, the philosophers, call this tadbirun nafs, you know, management of self, or self-governance. So you have to make a revolution inside you and turn this system upside down. You know, make your reason the ruler, and make your hedonistic self subject to al-aql, who's guided by the divine divine revelation. So in between, you have nafs lawwama, the critical self. You know, I mean, hedonistic self is dethroned, but fight is going on. But you are aware something is wrong. You know, you repent, you make mistakes, and you repent. Revolution is not complete. In the type 3 self, revolution is complete. The nafs has itmi'nan, the true happiness, as-sa'ada al-uzma. So the aql is ruling. So see, this is the Sufi approach. This is not mystic. You know, I mean, the Sufi approach is to make aql the dominant power inside the self. See what I mean? But this is a different kind of aql. It's al-aql al-ma'adi, metaphysical aql, not al-aql al-ma'ashi. Al-aql al-ma'ashi focuses only in this world. It's instrumental reason. But al-aql al-ma'adi, the holistic, comprehensive intelligence aql, which sees the whole existence and lives accordingly. So that's the type of aql tasawwuf or Islam wants the real ruler. So this is what ought to be. So nafs ammara is what it is, and nafs mutma'inna is what it ought to be. So we don't take what sociological, like statistical research shows us, like the majority people have, as human nature. Through siyasat al-qalbiyya or tadbir al-nafs, we want to move from type 1 self to type 3 self. How do you do this? So love, service, fellowship, God consciousness, riyadatun nafs, mujahada, these are all methods, to move in these marahil, as Sheikh Amin said. So these are the methods. Each one of them requires long conference and long talk, but I'm just touching on them and move because I have a limited time. And if you compare the nafs ammara and nafs mutmainna, what are the differences? So inside, the difference, like who rules, which faculty rules, this aql al-ma'adi or nafs al-ammara, which one rules? So the practical and concrete manifestation of this change inside is the change of attributes, like the virtue, as attributes, and also practical actions. So there's a long list of virtues and the actions emanating from it. So the self in modern social sciences, according to the modern social science, which take the majority as given and human nature. So as I said, it's based on what we call nafs ammara. And if you want to understand modern society and modern civilization, go and read the sections on nafs ammara in the tasawwuf books. You understand what goes on in the world better. Okay, not the social science books. Don't read Durkheim and Weber and Marx. Read the nafs ammara section in tasawwuf books. You will understand better because their understanding of human nature is based on the people at the level of nafs ammara. For instance, the concept of homo economicus, who maximizes, his interest. And then homo homini lupus, Thomas Hobbes, uses, and like what David Hume said, reason is and ought only to be the slave of passions. This is nafs ammara, and Freud, and like all other people, so from their perspective, there is absolute determinism. Human nature is either evil or good. But then Foucault argues that nothing is stable, nothing is determined. Both of them are right. Both of them are right. As I said, there is some part given and some part is not given. So Foucault looks at the empty part of the glass, which we need to fill, through our free will and actions. The modernists, they look at the programmed part of it. But from a multiplex perspective, human nature is not fixed at birth. Human beings have the potential and inclination to go either way. وَهَدَيْنَاهُ النَّجْدَيْنِ إِمَّا شَاكِرًا إِمَّا كَفُورًا. So, all right. So for modernists, what is what ought to be, equal. So this is the positivist conception of the self in social sciences. For postmodernists, there is no is and there is no ought. We cannot know is and ought. It's all unstable and not fixed. From multiplex approach, what is not equal to what ought to be. Okay, so this gives rise to a critical perspective on the self and society, because you make a distinction between what it is and what it ought to be, and what it ought to be is not given. We need to reach there through critical examination of ourselves and our society. So this reflects itself on praxis. The project of restructuring, reorganizing, re-regulating society through Tadbirul Nafs, ethics, Tadbirul Manzil, economics, and Tadbirul Medina. And Tadbirul Nafs, as I said, is equal to Siyasa al-Qalbiyya. But how can we know what it ought to be? So through modernists, they say personal judgment and pure reasoning, which is based on the ideologies, like rational ideologies, communism, capitalism, socialism, liberalism. And for postmodernists, there is no objective standard for ethical norms. But from multiplex ontology, we can use sense perception, reasons, and reported knowledge. Al-Khabar al-Sadiq, fiqh, tasawwuf, al-hikmah al-amaliyya. These are all disciplines to show us what it ought to be. So in conclusion, I say that Ghazali's conception of the self offer an alternative model to explain human action based on the following premises. First, human ontology is multiplex, body, mind, and soul. These three components constitute human existence. Second, the completion and perfection of a human being take place not only in the mind, but also in the heart, in the soul, and it manifests in our attributes and actions. So this is a practical outcome. Third, the self is multiplex, and the ruling faculty is either nafs ammara, which is like appetitive self, or critical self, or the content self. Fourth, the ideal mental spiritual state is the content self. There are beings that are complete and perfect, like nature, animals, but human beings are not perfect. To be insan kamil, you need tarbiyah, tazkiyah, and education. Pure observation of society might not provide proper explanation of social laws and norms, since what is happening in society is not necessarily what ought to be. And this requires a critical engagement with self and social phenomena, while calling forth a project of restructuring, reorganizing the self, the inner self, and society in order to turn what is into what ought to be, perfection of what was not complete and perfect before. So this is what requires our effort. So Kamal for human beings is not given. Kamal requires effort. And Insan Kamil is the one who goes through these stages. And Insan Kamil does not mean someone who doesn't make any mistakes. Insan Kamil means someone who is open to accept his or her mistakes, like Sayyidina Adam alayhi salam, and compensate for them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your intriguing presentation. I think your statement of, the civilization of nafs ammara was quite interesting, actually, because when I watch TikTok, TikTok, right? It's a latest application. I always overwhelmed by the souls of nafs ammara, when I watch it. And also in modern, the shopping mall is also the same. It's the whole manifestation of nafs ammara, and we need somehow the new method to control, this overflow of nafs ammara, inshallah. And the next presentation will be Professor Muhammad Hammoud. And Professor Muhammad Hammoud is an academic economist and also as well as a practitioner of the participation finance. I think his contribution is quite huge for us, because we are holding this kind of project not only for academic sake, but also we hope to build a better future and better society. And his career as a practitioner is really important. He is contributing in multiple banks, also managing companies. And today his presentation is Levity and the Self. So Professor, the floor is yours.
Is it on? Okay. So is the presentation on? Okay. All right. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. My presentation is overly ambitious. talking about liberty and the self in 20 minutes. But I thought it is important to touch on the subject at least. And what I would like to do is start with a well-known story from the Islamic tradition, which is the story of the repentance of Bishr al-Hafi, Bishr the barefoot. It is said that Bishr al-Hafi, who was one of the very well-known early ascetics and learned Ahl al-Tazkiyah, was a prince of Basra and had a great mansion and used to hold celebrations and parties where singing and drinking and enjoyment of all sorts were practiced. And one day when he was in one of these events, discuss this, which is an episode, a little booklet on how رسالة في أدب العلم epistle on the proprieties of seeking knowledge by Ibn Ata'illah secondary, where he clearly where he clearly gives different configurations and a multiplexity of levels. So there is one level which is physical level, beyond, which is the relation to the creator, to the nurturer, Ar-Rabb. And people can be of two attitudes toward this. They can consider themselves in a position of poverty and need. They can consider themselves in a position of self-sufficiency and istighna and no need. And then you have the relation, which is another level, with creation, whether it is material creation or society. These are two important dimensions. And people can be, in fact, through their subjectivity, either sufficient in God from the entire creation or dependent on the creation. So what Ibn Ata'illah says is that there are two configurations. You are either needful of God in your attitude. You realize that He is the source of your existence, the source of your being, and you are, after your existence, what you were to Him before your existence, this contingent being whose very existence depends on God. And in that case, you are sufficient in God from all creation. Because in the same way as your existence and everything that your sustenance came from Him, then you do not depend on the substance to get it. You depend on the one who brought you the substance. That is one configuration which Ibn Ata'illah considers praiseworthy. Now, the other consideration is the exact opposite. You can consider yourself self-sufficient with respect to God, ignore your origins, your contingency. But in that case, what is your attitude toward creation, toward your needs, the food that you need to eat, the people who you need to collaborate with? Well, in that case, you are in complete need and poverty toward creation, toward finding your sustenance, toward collaboration with the members of your society. So that configuration Ibn Ata'illah would consider blameworthy and problematic and a source of individual loss. Okay, so I think it is with this framework that I'd like to start thinking about the question of liberty and the modern conception, evolution of the modern conception of liberty. But first of all, I'd like to give some scriptural references to Ibn Ata'illah's model, if you will, of freedom and liberty. The first one, call it the praiseworthy, the metaphysical conception of faqr, and its relation to divine sovereignty, divine self-sufficiency, is very much expressed in the Quran, actually in 3 verses relating to 3 levels. You could say the level of essence, and I apologize for the bad translation, the level of attributes, and the level of acts. So relating to the level of essence, the verse talks about فاطر السماوات والأرض وهو يطعم ولا يطعم. He is the originator of the heavens and the earth. So all of their existence comes from their origin from God. and he who feeds and is not fed. All of their sustenance, everything that we need from this world is he gives us, and he doesn't need anybody to give him sustenance. So it's about need and existence of the human being. The second level I would call autonomy. So the first level is self-sufficiency, the concept of self-sufficiency. The level of autonomy is about attributes, about rules, about laws, about things that are characterized. And the verse here is very pertinently refers to malakut, to governing with rules. قُلْ مَنْ بِيَدِهِ مَلَكُوتُ كُلِّ شَيْءٍ وَهُوَ يُجِيرُ وَلَا يُجَارُ عَلَيْهِ. Yujir here, in whose hand is the dominion of everything? He who rules and is not subject to rule if you have knowledge. Yujiru is a protective rule that you put, and all rules in Islamic wisdom, divine rules, are to protect us from harm. So these rules in the divine, they are self-imposed. كتب على نفسه الرحمة. Allah Ta'ala is autonomous in حرم على نفسي إني حرمت على نفسي الظلم على نفسي. He prohibits on himself oppression and decrees mercy on himself. So God is autonomous, whereas the human being is subject to the divine rules, to the divine norms. And finally, at the level of acts, you can call this actual sovereignty. لا يسأل عما يفعل وهم يسألون. He is not held into account by any authority as to what he does, yet they are held into account. They are questioned. So these concepts are extremely central in the Quranic scripture at all of their levels of self-sufficiency, of autonomy and sovereignty, and contrasted in absolute ways in terms of the opposition between the divine and creation. Now, the second thing that's very important, and we'll not have time to take it, is sovereignty is one and indivisible. Let me. Just one verse, and I will not touch on it, but a lot of communitarianism and a lot of modern solutions miss this very important. I'm just going to read the verse, and it may be good background for discussion at some point. God has not taken to himself any son, nor is there any God with him. For then each God would have taken off what it created, and some would have risen up over others. Glory be to God, beyond that they describe. In another verse, Allah Ta'ala says, if there were gods other than him, then the heavens and the earth would be corrupted, would be subject to complete chaos. Now, the other configuration, so this is the praiseworthy configuration of divine, of human poverty toward God. The other configuration is also described in the Quran and Sunnah. The self-sufficiency, the delusion of self-sufficiency of the human being toward God, I think is centrally described by the verse, أَفَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَاهُ. Have you seen him who has taken his caprice to be his God? So the metaphysical dimension is limited to simply that nafs al-ammara that and that is a form of human sovereignty on oneself, self-sufficiency, autonomy. And we will see in the same way as Professor Shenturk spoke about the modern world being the world of the perspective of nafs al-ammara, we will see it is the world of the autonomous sovereign self, the self-sufficient self, and we study the implications of this on liberty. And the hadith is very clear on this. The other side of the same self-sufficiency is total, it's a bigger subject than 5 minutes, but I will try, is the other side of the medal is total dependence on the world, as we saw from Ibn Ata'illah. The hadith that's well known is, woe to the servant of the dinar, woe to the servant of the dirham, woe to the servant of the silk garment, woe to the servant of the velvet cloth. People become completely dependent on their needs and their wants and their social standing and so on, in total poverty and dependence on them. A good analogy I find to understand this multiplexity is two clapping hands. Suppose the right hand, it needs to clap with the left hand. It can take two perspectives. Really, there are two configurations, the configurations of Ibn Ata'illah. Either it takes a holistic view that it is part of a body and it is subject to the command of the clapper. And in that case, it is totally independent of the other hand. The clapper will make the other hand come at the right place in the right time, and the clapping will happen. Or it could consider itself self-sufficient, independent of this more holistic view. And then it depends exactly on the left hand being at the right place at the right time. Otherwise, it won't clap. So this is a very nice analogy, actually, of the two configurations of liberty and dependence. Now let's move to the modern perspective. What I described as the blameworthy configuration is actually considered by some of the leading thinkers and intellectual historians of modernity as the distinctive modern problem. This is not a side issue. This is not just another thing that to talk about. Here is Robert Pippin, professor of philosophy at the University of Chicago, Chicago Sharif. In his book on modernism as a philosophical problem, what he says, I'm not going to read. He says, first of all, the theory of modernity is the theory of the autonomous self, of the self-sufficient nafs. And second, the distinctive modern problem of modernity, which the postmoderns have brought out from Nietzsche and Heidegger and those who followed them, is how is that self-sufficiency compatible with the dependence on things, on nature, and on society? How could these be reconcilable? You know, we thought that autonomy and self-sufficiency in the Enlightenment was liberating, and what we found is that they're enslaving. But that is exactly Ibn Ata'illah's point. And it is exactly something that can only be understood with a multiplex perspective. And this is what another very pertinent study has shown. This is Gerald Seigel from NYU, intellectual historian, who wrote in 2005, published his book on the idea of the self, studying 4 centuries from the 17th to the 20th century thought on the human self. And what he concludes is essentially, if you want to understand how people have thought, the different thinkers and critics and so on thought about the self, you need a multiplex view of the self. And he talks about 3 dimensions which we've already spoken about. He calls them the reflexive dimension, the material dimension, and the relational dimension. The reflexive dimension is that vertical dimension, which amongst all of these authors is characterized by self-sufficiency. And the material and relational dimension is essentially the dependence on nature and on society. And what Seigel says is that if you study all of these authors, all of these views of the self, what you will realize is that the more the authors who are more extreme in their views of self-sufficiency are at the same time more extreme in their views of dependency on society and on nature. That's the conclusion of his 700-page book. And that is Ibn Ata'illah's conclusion. Now, this specifically relates to dependence on society. And it is fascinating to follow the conception of liberty and its evolution throughout the modern intellectual history. So we need to start at the beginning. And the beginning in modern political theory is Thomas Hobbes, without any doubt. Quentin Skinner is probably the leading intellectual historian of political theory today. He is the head of what's called the Cambridge School. And he has focused on that switch in the conception of liberty in the 17th century, around the time of Thomas Hobbes and around the English Revolution. And he says that the concept of liberty introduced by Hobbes is unprecedented. So we need to understand what was liberty before this concept of liberty, which ended up being the accepted mainstream concept of liberty under the liberal political conceptions of today. He says liberty used to be what he calls Roman or Republican concept of not being subject to the arbitrary will of the other. If you're subject to the arbitrary will of the other, you're a slave. They tell you what to do without any justification. If you're subject to a justified will, you're not a slave. You're both following a higher principle. So the arbitrariness of the will is the issue, not the will itself. So if it is just to restitute a stolen property, you are free. This is liberty. It is just that this restitution is arbitrary. But if you're being expropriated of everything you own, that is arbitrary. What is the justification of that, right? Now you would think this is such a natural concept of liberty. That concept disappeared. And you want to ask why? It was replaced by the concept of Thomas Hobbes, which is, it is simply a factual question: are you being deprived of your property or not? Irrespective of whether that deprivation is arbitrary or justified. The broadly accepted, initially when Hobbes introduced this, he was defending absolute monarchs. He was a monarchist against the Republicans who actually had put the king to death because he was taxing them arbitrarily. And Hobbes said, what do you care? If in fact you can keep your property, whether it's arbitrary or not, you've kept it. Liberty is no constraints. It's like things. It's like there is a wall or there is no wall. You need a justification. And people initially dismissed Hobbes. He was just the subject of rejection. But actually, he ended up winning the day. And today, if you read, the consensus is that the definition of liberty is not being subject to constraints. And you want to ask, why has that concept died? And the true answer is that concept requires something other than self-sufficiency and autonomy. It requires a higher form, a higher source of value, of norm, of justice. It requires a definition of what is arbitrary. And that definition doesn't sit well with this autonomous, self-sufficient, sovereign self, because لا تسأل عما تفعل. So what do you talk to me about arbitrariness? So, and I think the best way to see this is to, sort through a lot of the philosophical baggage and argumentation and so on, which is very interesting, but obscures a lot of the issues. And I'd like to close with a philosopher who used to be at Columbia University, by the way. He's now retired, Robert Wolff. In the 60s, which extended into the early 70s, two important books came out, one more important than the other. Rawls' book on justice and Wolff's book in defense of anarchism. Now, people may not think, who are not specialized, may not think of that book as relevant, but initially the book was the favorite book to criticize, to defend against, and so on. But slowly the erosion of acceptance of authority made this, what he calls philosophical anarchism, quite a popular stance. And what does Robert Wolff say? He says autonomy of the self, which he takes as given, is incompatible with the acceptance of any state authority. And a truly autonomous self ought to be philosophically anarchistic in the sense that it should reject the legitimacy, we're back to arbitrary or not arbitrary, the legitimacy of state authority. It could accept to comply by state authority as a practical matter. You know, I'll pay my taxes, even if I think they are outrageously high and not justified. But it cannot accept its legitimacy because it is not supposed to accept the rule of other. It is supposed to be self-ruling. And the question of that Wolff addresses in the second part of his book is, well, people have tried to solve this problem through democracy. Isn't democracy self-rule of society in the same way as autonomy is self-rule to the self? He says, yeah, but democracy has problems. Unless it is unanimous direct democracy, in which case you're really ruling yourself. If it is indirect, it means you're accepting to be ruled by decisions of your representatives that may not represent what you're doing. If it is majoritarian, it is actually a tyranny of the majority against the minority. If it's a contractual agreement of social contract, you are accepting that down the road you will accept rules that are not your self-legislation but decided by others. Whichever way you turn out, it is illegitimate, and anarchy is the only compatible political philosophy for a truly responsible autonomous self. What's very interesting, and that's my last comment, is Wolff traces this back to Ibn Ata'illah's model. He says, maybe I should read this one. Let me see. He says, man confronts a natural world. So he's talking about the vertical autonomy and the dependence on nature and society. He says the profound reason why only anarchy, meaning the refusal of any, or the consideration that all social constraints are dependence, are not legitimate. He says it's the same thing, it comes from autonomy. He says, man confronts a natural world which is irreducibly other, which stands over against him, independent of his will and indifferent of his desires. So he depends on the natural world, on asbab, cause and effect, and so on. He says only religious superstition or the folly of an idealist metaphysics could encourage us to assume that nature will prove ultimately rational, or that the opposition between man and objects must in principle be surmountable. So he said Ibn Ata'illah's praiseworthy model is religious superstition or the folly of metaphysics. So he's rejecting that model for the model of autonomy of the self and naturalism. And then he turns to society. He says, man also confronts a social world which appears other, like nature, which appears to stand over against him, at least partially independent of his will and frequently capricious in its frustration of his desires. is it also folly to suppose that this opposition can be overcome and that man can so perfectly conquer society as to make it his tool rather than his master? So he says, I think society is my master. I'm autonomous and I should refuse all authority. And it would be as much a folly to think that somehow I can find legitimate authority as it would be a folly or a metaphysical folly to consider that somehow there's harmony in the natural world, there's mercy, wisdom, provision in my natural environment. So by the same rules that lead naturalism to generate dependence, the self-sufficiency, the autonomy of the self generates a rejection of authority and total arbitrariness and in political power. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your insightful presentation. By the way, there was the technological problem in the Zoom presentation. So internet viewers might face the the voice loss during his presentation. I'm sorry for that. So the third presenter will be the Professor Abdullah. He will make a presentation via Zoom. He is the principal of the Cambridge Muslim College and the founder of Shifa Integrated Counseling and co-founder and executive director of the International Association of Islamic Psychology. And Dr. Abdullah's clinical practice, as well as his academic research, focus on approaching the counseling from within an Islamic paradigm and establishing the indigenous Islamic theoretical orientation to human psychology. So the title of his talk is The Multiplex Approach to Psychology and Reorienting to the Study of the Soul from Within the Islamic Paradigm. So Professor Abdullah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's really an honor to be here with these esteemed scholars. I only wish I could be there with you in the room, but alhamdulillah, I'm glad that I'm able to attend this way. So is everyone able to see the presentation?
Yes, we can see.
Alhamdulillah. So I'm going to talk today about Islamic psychology or psychology, this multiplex approach. And what I want to talk about is considering ilm an-nafs, so this understanding of the study of the soul from within the Islamic tradition, but in the context of contemporary psychology. And then I'm going to talk about methodology, reflexivity, and self-knowledge of how this applies to putting this into practice and really making it, because we're talking about the study of the self, actually having understanding of our own self in this process being important. And then I want to talk about a little bit of my own work as an example of how we can actually do this work and putting it into praxis by constructing a framework for application in this contemporary context. And then some implications for what that means in terms of practice and actually helping people. So within the Islamic tradition, we have an existing understanding of the selves. And this is both theoretical, but also very integrated into theory always is the practice, the practical application of that understanding. And we find this really throughout all of the Islamic sciences, because the primary purpose of the deen of Islam is for the transformation of the self. It's really a path of the development, for the development of the human being. And like Dr. Senturk was saying, from what it is to what it ought to be. But the advent of the notion of psychology sort of as a separate discipline is really a recent thing. And within the Islamic tradition, this was part of a whole. And so you would find it within fiqh, within kalam, within falsafa, within tasawwuf. I just want to show sort of an example of how you can see that concepts that are known within the field of contemporary psychology and are generally attributed to these thinkers on the right, going as far back as the 16th century really only, but mostly from the 19th and 20th century, were actually conceived of and written about by early Muslim scholars as far back as the 8th century with Ibn Sirin and dream interpretations, and you can see all of these details. But these scholars weren't known as psychologists because that wasn't really a thing. They were polymaths, though. They were mostly known as philosophers or physicians even. And that's obviously partly because these were brilliant scholars and their level of understanding crossed disciplines, but also because the Islamic sciences were seen and in reality are really a holistic endeavor of understanding the human predicament, and that all knowledge is integrated. And so this knowledge of the soul and the understanding of the practical applications of it in self-knowledge were sort of assumptions of Muslim life. It was understood that theory and praxis were integral to the practice of the deen. And Muslim societies in these times when we're always going back to referencing the classical scholars as if this was sort of the time to go back to, which it was because there was so much work happening, but also because of the function of those societies were more holistic. And so they provided the context for this. Religion was taught from within life. Scholars wouldn't just study and memorize texts, they would be understanding the knowledge in context within the community and within application. And so self-reflection and self-knowledge was a key part of that, both for the scholar and for the public who they serve with that knowledge, right? And so it was about experiential knowledge, not just philosophizing for the sake of knowledge, but for the sake of illumination of the heart and change. And so now, really, we have become sort of disaggregated from this. And we even find that many scholars study books and memorize texts, maybe without even the practice of tazkiyah or the practical application of the knowledge, and really impressing that all knowledge really is meant to illuminate the heart. And so we really are in a place in time where we need to revive and reorient because we have lost touch with this holistic and integral nature of knowledge and of the human being. And we see this perhaps especially in the conception of psychology. You'll notice this picture of this severed head with a brain is often what you see on psychology textbooks. And it is a great symbol of the disaggregation of the understanding of the self. It is separate, it is relegated to synapses in the brain, because really as a collective almost reality of our societies is that we've become uncomfortable with the core spiritual reality of ourselves. And this is our veiled reality. And so our understanding of psychology is at that level of the veiled level that we are seeing. And so we are mostly talking about in psychology, logic, intelligence, thinking, and very much influenced by Cartesian dualism, even across the Muslim world. And so the history and practice of psychology in the West is certainly diverse and varied. You can't really say, it's probably unfair to say that it's all, that we paint it with a broad brush and call it Western psychology, because clearly it's not a monolith. At the same time, however, there really is a precedent for understanding that there's a dominant paradigm of psychology in Western academia and within the professional field of practice. And that dominant paradigm clearly has developed primarily in Europe and the United States since the 19th century. And there's an enormous role that this dominant paradigm plays, of the dominant paradigm of psychology plays in regulating social structure, thought, notions of self. And while this sort of hegemonic psychological discourse certainly had Christian heritage and underpinnings, really the underpinning of that dominant psychological discourse is avowedly secular in its nature and its commitments. But as the uncovering of this sort of metaphysical reality is available to everybody, and certainly has parallels in other traditions, the secular field has started to reintroduce a holistic picture of the human being. And so now you start to see a lot of talk in psychology about mind, body, soul. So it's coming back to its roots of connecting with these traditions, but mostly drawing on Buddhist and Hindu thought. And there are certainly parallels here with the Islamic tradition, but in reality, it pales in comparison to the depth and detail with which the study of knowledge of the self or the soul exists within the Islamic tradition. Because we have, within these Islamic sciences throughout, we have a complex understanding of the soul that sort of goes as deep as you want it to go. And so we could say that these are all dimensions of understanding of the human being, right? So we can understand it certainly from neuropsychology and neurology. We can understand it from a sense of the mind, body, soul. But this is our understanding from our level of being veiled in our condition here in the dunya realm. And so this awareness of mind, body, soul, these have their merit from a certain vantage point, from the station of the observer. But as I said, the rabbit hole goes just about as far as you want to take it. And the Islamic tradition offers a way to approach the entire picture. So why should we then limit ourselves, especially when the whole project of humanity is to go through this process of change and development and to maximize potential? We know from the Prophet, the example of the Prophet, ﷺ, and our human being status of Khalifatullah, that the potential is enormous. And for us, as at our station, really is endless. But still, as a collective ummah, we still are under the veils of this dominant paradigm. And we have lost touch with our own tradition, unfortunately. My teacher and my mentor, Professor Malik Badri, Allah have mercy on him, addressed this over 40 years ago in his book, The Dilemma of Muslim Psychologists. And he talked about how the Muslims in psychology tend to adopt the secular paradigm, often as a post-colonial reaction to feelings of inferiority. And so he said that they follow the dominant paradigm right into the lizard's hole, taking from the hadith of Prophet ﷺ. And from that, he outlined 3 stages of the Muslim psychologist: infatuation, reconciliation, and emancipation, as they're going through sort of just adopting to realizing and looking back to our heritage in the Islamic tradition to come at it from a different stage. And he told me, Dr. Malik told me just before he passed away, that he finally felt on a collective level that the Ummah is just beginning to move into or be ready to move into this stage of emancipation. And certainly in the last 3 years or so even, this has really been the case, where now we have a field called Islamic psychology, where people like my colleague, Dr. Human Kashavarzi, are really paving the way in defining this new field that honors the tradition, but making it relevant and accessible for the contemporary context. And so now that we are moving into this emancipation phase, it's about understanding a different paradigm of psychology. And it's not just adapting the secular paradigm of psychology as a science to work with Muslims or a cultural group, but as Professor Malik, he likened it to this process of sort of taking the West and Islamizing it. He likened it to, you take a decrepit building that's falling apart, but you want to make it look good, and so you would put a fresh coat of paint on it. And essentially that's what we tend to do, is we sort of, we put an Islamic paint and hope that, we sort of, this is the stage of reconciliation. But the emancipation is, and this is what Dr. Malik was calling for all these years, was the construction of a new building. And that by destroying the decrepit building, because it's not useful for us, or it's misleading, it doesn't mean that you're saying all of it is no good, because certainly there are good things that come of that. And so he said, you build this new building, you take some of the wood that is still good, you take some of the nails that are still good, but we need to construct this new paradigm on a foundation that is Islamic, and it's rooted in the Islamic tradition, but room for, even within that, Islamic psychologies perhaps. And so these here are just some aspects of how an Islamic paradigm of psychology really flipped the script and become a completely different way of understanding the human being, and therefore practical application of it when you see things like the akhirah, bala, what that means, the notion of the qalb being the center of consciousness, the spiritual state of the ruh, and this idea of the soul being ultimately the goal being in submission. These are things that just do not exist in a secular paradigm. And so my work, just as an example, is really building on Dr. Badri's work and trying to help us just move further into the stage of emancipation by attempting to lay a few bricks in this new construction. And so I've just recently published this book, and where I present my research. And the idea is to make it make sense, take all this, mapping these deep understandings of the self, but understanding it in context for how does that work for the layperson? How does it work for people struggling with life? How does it work for actual practical way of doing it in something like psychotherapy versus having it be this religious, philosophical thing up here, and then we do life over here and we stay disaggregated. We need to find ways to really put this into practice. And so the aims of this research, it's to really develop a framework to work from that we can then start to do this iterative, creative process. Because I think this multiplex project needs to be iterative, needs to be an iterative process, not just theorizing, but putting into practice and then making changes as we go. Because, modifying and iterating based on real world application. And this means being creative. It means thinking outside the box. It means taking chances. Otherwise, we remain in this sort of world of the abstract, where we're philosophizing about theology, and the people who need to benefit from what the Islamic tradition has to offer are not able to benefit because it doesn't come down to a practical level and benefiting from the knowledge, which is really the purpose of knowledge. And so we could easily get stuck in trying to map out all the permutations of the reality of psychology of the human being, but then we lose the majority of the people who need to benefit from it. And what good is that really? It needs to be understood in the context of our current reality. And that's exactly what the classical scholars were doing within their own time, incorporating the current thinking and the zeitgeist of their time. So for me, this approach really has to, especially in the field of psychology, has to involve reflexivity, has to involve knowledge of the self, not only for the being observed, but for the observer. And so if we're removed from this notion of the embodiment of the self and the integration of the soul in our own experience, this will show in our removed and detached way that we conceptualize social theories. And so there is no pre-existing theory of Islamic psychology or Islamic psychotherapy, because while we can draw on comparisons of the Sufi shayukh and murids, it's entirely different context. We need to imagine and discover what that needs to look like in the contemporary context, based on the reality of these current times. And so Al-Misri, in his book on the epistemological bias in the physical and social sciences, talks about it as a creative project with a group of scholars trying to apprehend what is implicit. And so my process of doing this in the book, I have, as I present the research, I'm also presenting my own reflections and my own process and self-awareness to sort of remove this notion of not the researcher not being biased. And so, it's reminding that there's real complex people undertaking research and disrupting this illusion of a detached authority for whom the effort is effortlessly smooth, and really embracing self-knowledge, especially as psychologists and researchers. It's imperative that we are self-aware. So the study, I'll just go through this quickly. The idea was to have two phases. One is to identify the sort of understanding of the self from the Islamic tradition and taking from these different sources, and then what does that look like in practical application? And so I did this by first interviewing scholars from different traditions or from different disciplines. And so we have a representation of kalam, fiqh, falsafa, and tasawwuf. And so that from these people's understanding and understanding the theory and having the knowledge, but then in conversation and having those viewpoints represented while we sort of work it out, in form of qualitative input, as talking about what does this mean for contemporary context, understanding the contemporary notions of psychology in dialogue with me as the researcher, as a psychologist. So it's this project. And out of that first phase came this model. And obviously you can conceptualize it many different ways, as we found Dr. Senturk's great explanation of the different stages of the nafs, as you see here indicated on the right. It's the same idea of movement, right? So it's not, in an Islamic conception, it wouldn't just be the anatomy of the soul, but how does that work with a process of change, and the process of change being integrated into how we understand it, because that is the purpose. And so movement and development, again, from what it is to what it ought to be. And so this is, you can find out more about this in this article. It's also in the book, describing the dynamics. But again, Dr. Senturk sort of walked us through that. And then the second stage was to take that, once understanding how the self is positioned with the ruh and the connection to Allah and these other things that are involved, not just the perceived self, then what does that look like in something like psychotherapy, where we're trying to make it work for people, put it into use, put it into application. And so I worked with people that had three different sort of levels of training based on the station of the therapist. Some of them were sort of trying to, on their own project, trying to incorporate Islamic principles in. Some had specific training in this. Some were trained in tasawwuf and had a much deeper tool belt to work from. And so there's these different approaches based on the different stations and dimensions. And out of that came this model of this iceberg model. And what you can see here is that it reflects this idea of the different dimensions, right? So the Western model, again, just using that as a convention, really only deals with the mulk, or the material world, and what you can see above the surface. So the behavior and maybe the cognition. And so it's limited in what you are dealing with, therefore what the treatment goal can be and what the outcomes can be. But from a multiplex Islamic paradigm, we include the non-material, the malakut, and the divine, the lahut. And so you see this reflected in the deeper levels of the unseen reality of the human being, and allowing for that to actually be considered in something like psychology, where you're not just dealing with the presenting problem and trying to address them based on behavior, but understanding that this human being has a divine reality and a connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then also understanding, going back to this understanding things like ilham and ru'ya, kashf, khawatir, and incorporating these things and understanding that there's this unseen reality, allowing for those to be there because they are a part of this paradigm. And then just to wrap up the presentation of the research was understanding how this fits in something like psychotherapy. And so this model was to understand, what does that mean? What does Islamic psychotherapy mean in the tradition, in the context of what we know in Tasawwuf with a Sheikh and Murid relationship? It's not taking the place of that and understanding the parameters of where this is. And so how it fits within the limitations of our contemporary psychology, and that it's not spiritual guidance, but it's with the integration of the spiritual reality, allowing for the spiritual reality to come into the space of psychology and making clear distinctions of how we can allow for these different levels of being within the limitations of people's station. And that's the station of the client, as well as the station of the therapist. So in this model of working, the state of the therapist's heart, their own self-knowledge, then becomes of primary importance, at almost the utility of the method. So it's a very different paradigm. So even in the Western therapies, they understand this notion of self as instrument. But I think what we have to present from the Islamic model is this further elucidation of how important that is and how deep self-purification process can go, and allowing for these exponential levels of growth beyond merely reaching equilibrium. So here we have in the middle, this is where we're trying to get people to be in a state of equilibrium, as Dr. Senturk said, coming into this with the nafs al-lawama, this battleground, and choosing to be on this journey towards what it ought to be. But the what it ought to be is really endless, and it can go on a much higher level. And then you get deeper into levels of experience of the spiritual reality, which maybe then goes outside of the scope of Islamic psychotherapy into the realm of tasawwuf. And so the idea, though, is not removing ourselves from the possibility of these higher dimensions by limiting our understanding of psychology, and neither limiting our willingness to deal with the unseen realm, the realm of the soul. And so, you know, Allah says, and they ask you about the soul, say the soul is one that commands of my Lord, and you are not given aught of knowledge but a little. So now, based on our station and our place in this dimensions, we can read that ayah to be understood that little is known about the ruh, but you can also, it can be read to understood from a different station that there are little from among us who have been given knowledge of the soul, of the ruh. And so we need to revive this science and expand our potential for reaching and accessing this spectrum of experiences of being. And so I'll just close by talking a bit about the implications of this for practice, is that, you know, we have the ability to put this a framework so that we have a reason to feel or a way that clinicians can start to integrate spiritual reality without necessarily having to only rely on the shayukh for these deep levels of spiritual transformation, but understanding that we, at every level, even if it's just dealing with depression, we need for people to be moving forward. And so also the implications for the non-Muslim world, learning what Islam has to offer, because there is this fitra dimension that is universal. It has universal appeal, and it is just like intelligent people, regardless of their real affiliation, have been able to benefit from mindfulness in psychology. So too can we, inshallah, there will come a time when the academy and the ummah and the world can learn what a rich Islamic tradition has to offer in advancing the understanding of the human being and practical pathways to actively improving lives. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Thank you very much for next presentation will be Professor Mr. Baku. Professor is an assistant professor at the Alliance Relation Institute of the University. He received his PhD in Sarraj University. And his main research interest is argumentation of reasoning and religiosity, discourse analysis, ecology, and studies. And Mr. Ahmed, he is currently the research assistant at the Department of Comparative Literature at the University. His research area is the assessment of modern societies for contemporary scholarship. The title of their presentation is the Munazara in between dialogical and monological approaches of argumentation. This floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Okay, the presentation will be about argumentation, and we take argumentation seriously. And I hope today we'll try to discuss argumentation with the light of multiplexity. The study of argumentation has a renewed interest in academia, especially after the 1950s. Scholars start to work on argumentation and take argumentation seriously, but actually this is one of the oldest areas of study. And maybe it is, some say 2,000 years, some say 3,000 years, but some dates back to Aristotle. But you can have a lot of studies in Chinese called tradition as well. So this is one of the oldest things that humanity has been interested. And especially think of this way, argumentation, even God conveys the holy message by simply arguing with believers and non-believers. And we are simply argumentative beings. We do things through argumentation, actually. We become human through argumentation. And argumentation is a conveyor belt for change. So why we should care about argumentation? It's a conveyor belt for change. I mean, it defines and redefines the contours of reasonableness. But simply by good arguments, we may start thinking differently. Because I think of this way, the best example would be like slavery, for instance. Once something was very reasonable, with some good arguments, now we cannot even think about it as an option. Although Hoca talk about slavery from a different perspective, master slave, about freedom, liberty. But now, because of some good arguments, we cannot even think of slavery as an option. Or we don't need to go back that far. For instance, driving license for women. In some countries, as you know well, even women cannot drive. And some people just take it naturally, very reasonably. But with some good arguments, it's not reasonable at all. And you cannot even argue in that direction. So argumentation, that's why we are taking it very seriously. It gives potential for change, and we can rethink a lot of already given statements, assumptions through argumentation, and we can re-examine the way we think about reality. In this presentation, by the way, we will present together with Rahmi, and I will first start with the argumentation in the West, and we will deal with one of the most difficult questions of truth in argumentation. What we're gonna do with truth in argumentation? Why do we argue? Are we after truth, or we do something else with argumentation? So the crucial question is, okay, I should maybe move forward a little bit. The crucial question is, why do we argue? For instance, if you're a merchant, this is also thanks to Hammur Hoca, one of his previous presentations. If you're a merchant, your maybe reason of argumentation is simply interest. This is perfectly fine. Or if you're a politician, you may argue just for the sake of re-election, let's say. But as a scholar, why we argue? I think we should think seriously about this. And that's why we invite this question of truth into the study of argumentation. And why we are interested in this question? Because I just said the argumentation has renewed interest. And actually in the West, the study of argumentation started with these two books in 1958. The one is Toulmin, the other one is Obrecht, Tikita, and Perelman. So they were the ones who renewed interest in argumentation. Before them, actually the study of argumentation was dominated by formal logic. Simple, this kind of, let's say, exercise, the incontrovertible truth, burhan, or demonstrations. We used to think that, or the scholars, philosophers, before them, especially 19th century philosophers, think that if we reach at Burhan, incontrovertible truth, that's it. This is the real domain of argumentation, and this is our aim. But actually, these two guys said argumentation starts when logic finishes, when logic ends. And they discarded the possibility of truth in argumentation from 1950s onwards. And today, actually, they gave rise to two schools, very prominent, very hegemonic schools. One is rhetorical school, the other one is dialectical school, pragma dialectics. And in these two schools today, and if you go to any argumentation conference, you will see the logical strand is not anymore valid, but these two groups are dominating the argumentation scholarship, and the basic assumption they favor is truth or demonstration doesn't have a place in argumentation. So they simply excommunicated, let's say, these guys, logicians, from the study of argumentation, and they come up with two different disciplines, let's say, two different approach to argumentation. And of course, their conception of the goal of argumentation is different. What they understand as a purpose of argumentation is different from one another. Okay, the third one, the new rhetoric, what Perelman and Obrecht-Tikita says, the object of theory of argumentation is study of discursive techniques allowing us to induce or to increase the mind's adherence to the thesis presented for its assent. This is a rhetorical definition of argumentation. What simply we do is we try to convince one another, that's it. So they are interested in the processes within which we are persuaded. Simply, let's say, we translate our minds. It's a kind of translation of minds when we actually discuss, when we actually debate. This is the basic aim of argumentation. And they say, this is from the first page of the book, it is good practice not to confuse, it's not visible there, not confuse at the beginning the aspects of reasoning relative to truth and those relative to adherence, truth and adherence. We should not confuse them, but to study them separately, even though we might have to examine later their possible interference and correspondence. Only on this condition is it possible to develop a theory of argumentation with any philosophical scope. So they say, okay, demonstrations exists, and evident, let's say self-evident, of course they exist in our lives, but the argumentation is domain of probable. So there should be some doubt. If there's no doubt, there's no argumentation. So they say simply we should just discard demonstration from our study, but we should just focus on the doubt. So despite they accept the place of truth in philosophy, but they say truth doesn't exist in argumentation. If you want to understand argumentation, forget about truth, they say. That it cannot be aim of argumentation. And similarly, by the way, this is the rhetorical strand. But if you look at the dialectical strand, we see something else. By the way, they call or they name them as anthropo-relativistic understanding of reasonableness, these rhetoricians. But when you look at the pragma dialectics, they call themselves as critical school. So they look at simply the procedures when we argue, when we argue one another. And they also say truth doesn't have a place in argumentation. And let me read this one. The geometrical view of reasonableness, but this is the logical strand. They call it geometrical. Geometrical view of reasonableness is an integral part of demonstrative tradition, which is in fact anti-argumentative, although this fact is usually obscured by the veiled way in which this dogmatic view is presented. Any reference to truth is received as dogmatic. If you rely on any demonstrative, let's say, premise, it's received as dogmatic. But mainly what we do in dialectics is we simply give and take arguments and we try to convince one another, persuade one another through best arguments. This is another good quotation from Vannemer and Grostendorf's book. This is the basic book, the most important book in pragma dialectics, I think, to understand their theoretical position. The starting point of the critical perspective on reasonableness is, philosophically speaking, that we cannot be certain of anything. In dialectics, we cannot be certain of anything. This is a starting point. We should therefore be skeptical with regard to any claim to acceptability, whoever makes it and to whatever it refers to. This is very important. We should be very skeptical of. This critical perspective focuses preeminently on discussion. It encourages the systematic submission of the one party's standpoint to the another party's critical doubts. In this way, an explicit argumentation is elicited. This is in turn can be called into question until the difference of opinion is resolved in a manner that's acceptable to the parties involved. Simply, it says both parties put each other into critical doubts and we test each other's reasons. And at the end, the aim of argumentation is resolution of difference of opinion. So we do not try to reach at any truth here. We just try to resolve our difference of opinion through critical, let's say, through steps, through, how do you say, procedurally correct steps. And everybody should take procedurally correct steps and we will reach at a certain resolution of difference of opinion. This is the major aim, and truth does not have a place. But here, what we say is, with Adab al-Wasf al-Munazara now, Rahmi will talk. This is a very difficult discussion, actually, in argumentation, study of argumentation, and we think Muslim scholars resolve this problem, or they may contribute to this debate. In this age-old debate in argumentation scholarship in the West, and I think with Munazara, scholars will have something to say to this debate. Okay, you can start now.
Thank you very much. So, some of us here might find it confusing that, there are people who basically deny incontrovertible premises. There are people who believe that, sense perception is not valid. And we can say that, all those Westerners, they have gone crazy. And I think we should not go into that direction. And if you remember Ghazali and Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, you will remember the fact that, Ghazali, in his famous book, he first begins and he adopts sense perception. And then he says, okay, I cannot be sure of the incontrovertible premises, the Awail, Al-Mabadi as well. And then, what Ghazali finds solace in the end is that, after a certain illumination, that he says, okay, I can use this sense perception and universal uncontrovertible premises. So in that sense, we appreciate the fact that there is, in the contemporary discussion, there is this whole debate about truth. We appreciate this debate. And now we want to give you, maybe from beginning of this session, we have discussed about this issue of perfection of self. And Mohammed Hambourg Professor Hambourg discussed about the economical dimension of this. And then Recep Hoca discussed this, the political, actually, implications of it. Now we are going to speak about in terms of argumentation. What we are going to do is going to be in terms of argumentation. And what we think in this debate, the debate about incontrovertible premises, are there, is sense perception valid? Is incontrovertible premises valid? This is an epistemological question, and argumentation cannot solve this problem. We cannot solve this problem. You remember the whole discussion between the sophists and the philosophers of the ancient Greece. It still continues. So we cannot solve this problem. But I think what Munazara actually provides us an insight to contribute this debate is the fact that with how they offer an insight into adab. So we say this is not actually our claim, but Munazara developed at the end of 13th century, and it sought to combine the need for adab in dialogical interactions with the Aristotelian rigor of syllogistic rational reasoning. And if you remember from our discussion, from Androja's discussion, you will remember that the actual problem these two schools have with the people of with the people of formal logicians, the demonstrators, the truth-obsessed people, is they have beef with their attitude. They have beef their dogmatic manner. Actually, they found these people as adeptists. There is a problem with their adab. That's why they are like, rejecting this idea of truth. So then what is adab? How should we understand adab? And I think until now, the best example that I found from adab is from Sayyid al-Attas. And I think you can read it as well. I will give you a bit of a second. So you might see how Al-Attas understands adab in the way, in a multiplex way, the way that we discuss this whole issue. And now we also understand the fact that, why this whole issue of truth ties into this issue of multiplexity as well. But now, okay, we understand, adab al-bahth al-munazara, we understand what is adab. And adab is our recognition of finding our own place, which is a very hard endeavor, and which might take a longer time that we assume. Then what is munazara? Let us understand munazara. So this is from Gelenbebi, and it is very famous. And it's not, Gelenbebi, it could be any other author. They would define munazara as, I will read the English translation. The inquiry and argumentation is the exchange of discourse for the manifestation of truth. Now, this in itself, as we said, does not solve anything. So there are some people who say we don't act on truth, and there are some people who say we act on the basis of truth. What will solve is what we call the adab dimension will give us, and I think it will give us insights. So to understand, so we have discussed, Önder Hoca has discussed the contemporary dimension of how in the West, how in the contemporary argumentation literature, we have this whole debate. And if we go to the emergence of munazara, you will find a very similar debate in the end of 13th century there as well. So before munazara, we had two systems of argumentation. We had theologians and jurists, and we had the philosophers, the hukama. And for the theologians, it was the aim in argumentation was the manifestation of truth. And for the philosophers, it was to convince or to silence the opponent. And the difference is that, according to philosophers, we needed Aristotelian syllogisms and proofs. And according to the theologians, we needed naqli proofs and, most importantly, naqli procedures and adab, which is, I will not delve into this issue, but I will tell you how this naqli adab, we cannot go through this whole procedure of naqli adab, naqli proofs at the moment, but how this naqli adab works in our. And I mean, it's ideally. This is what we aim. It's not what it is, but this is what adab scholars prescribe to us. So this is from Ahmed Jadab Pasha. It's a very long citation, and it's the quote, and it's from the beginning of the book. I will just summarize to you. So the arguer strives for the manifestation of truth. However, following the Salafis Salihin, they are afraid that, if they are going to prove someone wrong, their ego will fall prey to the joy of, to joy of proving someone wrong. That's why an arguer strives for truth, but not for his own truth, not for her own truth, but the truth of the other party. So this is actually the adab of argumentation. This is what, at least, and this is the part that, we think that, there is something for us to get inspiration from munazara and to work towards it. Actually, me and Professor Professor Mehmet Ali Özergen and Önder Küçükkural, we wrote about this issue. So there are different perspectives in argumentation munazara literature. How, okay, there is adab, but which adab are we asking for and how it changes? So inshallah, if you are interested, we can send you the paper. So we say that, although munazara starts from the possibility of truth, it does so in the boundaries of ethical dialogical interaction. So we are not talking about a monological truth, a truth in which I am going to instruct you, in which I will authoritatively, teach you. No, it is something I'm working for your truth. I know this is hard. This is this is also we can say this is an ideological statement as well, but there are certain procedures that works for this. And in order to revive this whole tradition, we are now in the process of, with Professor Şentürk and Professor Önder Küçükkural, and we have established Argu Munazara Research Center, and we are preparing for a project in which we want to change the whole basic idea of debate cultures that we have now, in which you have this rhetorical long speeches and it's like wrestling matches. And we want to change this as much as we can do. And if you are interested, please email us here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for interesting presentation. By the way, there will be a lecture in Japan, so I would be careful about the method of argumentation when I watch the political inshallah. In Japan, there is no adab, in arguments.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay, so the floor is all yours. If you have any question, please raise your hands. Questions? No?
Assalamu alaikum. So you guys claimed, or it seems that Van Emeren claims that we should be skeptical about the notion of there being any type of truth. Yes. And it seems that in the beginning you seem to agree with that notion that even the Islamic philosophers would, or rather the mutakallim or the Islamic paradigm would agree with that notion. Is that correct? And would they also agree with that? Would the Islamic tradition and paradigm, would the holders of that paradigm, would they also agree with the notion that we should be skeptical about any notion of absolute truth?
No, but there is this whole very good, when we are discussing this issue of truth and monological truth, dialogical truth, there is this debate in the Munazara literature, and it's about, is it arrogance to object to incontrovertible premises? Is it, and if you are objecting to an incontrovertible premise, are you an arrogant person? Are you a vicious person? So there are two different approaches to here. Like the majority of the scholars, they say, it's arrogant. But if you remember Ghazali, then you will have to say Ghazali is an arrogant person. That's why there are some people who say, no, it's not arrogance. It's not arrogance. We don't say they are wrong. Maybe I myself, I believe in incontrovertible premises. Maybe as Ghazali, I have some light given upon me in which I have no doubt about incontrovertible premises. But at least we don't say that those people are intellectually vicious. We don't say these people are arrogant persons. This is why we say, more than, this is an epistemological question, but in terms of argumentation, we at least tell those people are not arrogant people. We don't ridicule the other position. This is why we say it can solve something.
So in the sense that we agree with the notion of absolute truth, so the Islamic paradigm would be closer to the older pre-Van Emeren paradigm.
I think
in that sense, at least.
I think this is an issue. I don't know, I don't want to give you this is what Islam says, but this is what I understand it. My understanding is, I understand the people who have problem with the incontrovertible premises, and we want to be of help to improve this dialogical interaction. This is why.
Actually, they say they aim at manifestation of truth. This is definition of their argumentation, and for Ahmet Cevdet Pasha.
Yes.
Yeah. I didn't understand your position.
Thank you, understand.
Do you have any question? Okay, please.
Can you hear me? All right, is this just to follow up? I think the question, just to reiterate, it relates to my question as well. Ghazali, Imam Ghazali, as we know, he questioned awlawiyat, right? He questioned the very first principles, and he had this very serious period of doubt. It seems that you're saying, from your understanding, most of the ulama, they would consider anybody who questions first principles of knowledge to be arrogant or confused or whatever. And if we look at Imam Ghazali's life, we can take a sympathetic approach, perhaps an exceptional approach, and be a bit more merciful or helpful. I think that was your answer, if I'm not mistaken. I'm also wondering if you've read, I think Dr. Ömer Türker has an article in Sabah magazine about this, about Imam Ghazali's. What did you think of that? I thought I might ask you that first.
Do you mean it's like this whole issue of the later Juwayni and how he breaks from? And
no, this is specifically about Imam Ghazali's experience, where he understands first principles, in the case of Imam Ghazali, to have been broken down completely, and that they come through this light, and they are almost like spontaneously created within Ghazali
that's great.
himself. It's really amazing. I mean, the way he described it. I'm just wondering if you've read that and if you.
Unfortunately, but please send me. Thank you very much.
Okay, inshallah. We'll follow up later.
Is there any question on the floor? Okay.
Okay. Jim, it's about the instrumental mind. What comes to my mind is basically utilitarianism. Utilitarianism.
Yes.
And I mean, when you said that there is instrumental mind and there is the mind that cares about the benefits or cares about the destiny in the afterlife. What came to my mind is that, I mean, the utilitarianism, in the school of utilitarianism, like you want to maximize benefit, but it's not that, for example, it's not like shallow, yani. You would take into consideration the long-term benefits. So why don't we consider afterlife as a long-term benefit? And therefore the instrumental mind would be the same as the other like holistic mind. And utilitarianism would be basically zuhd. And utilitarianism would turn into like, I don't know, yeah, zuhd again.
Zuhd from Jannah.
Zuhd from dunya, because if you care about your destiny in the afterlife, you would become a zahid. Like the most utilitarian person would be the most zahid person. In that, I mean, you.
Yes, actually, someone made a will that his property after death should be given to the most intelligent people in the world. And then the fuqaha discussed like who are the most intelligent people, and eventually they reached the conclusion that the most intelligent ones are the zahid people. So they gave the property to zahid people based on the hadith that al-kayyisu man dana nafsahu wa amila lima ba'dahu. So the intelligent person is the one who controls his nafs, his desires, his hedonistic drives, and then works for the akhirah, as you said. So he's the intelligent one. And then wal-ajizu man atba'a nafsahu hawaha wa tamanna min Allahi al-amaniya. So the opposite of al-kayyis, al-ajiz. Why al-ajiz? I was surprised, when I read this hadith. Why ajiz is the opposite of al-kayyis? Because he's ajiz, because he's defeated by his desires. He could not control his nafs. He could not fight against shaitan. He's defeated. That's why he's ajiz. So the opposite of al-kayyis is al-ajiz. Very interesting. So aql ma'adi includes aql ma'ashi. So the promise of Islam is for this dunya and for the akhirah. As-salahu fil hal والفلاح في المآل يعني في المآل يعني في الآخرة يعني so promise of Islam is not only for the hereafter. Promise of Islam is for this world to make us happy, prosperous, successful, you know, and also for the Akhirah. So Aql Ma'adi does not reject, does not exclude the maslaha, the manfa'a of the people in this world and in the Akhirah. As you said, you know, they have a broader approach in defining what's beneficial, you know, what's your interest in the broader context. So sometimes it limits, you know, people's instincts, animal desires, you know, but this is for the benefit of human beings. Like fasting, you know, I mean, from the perspective of Aql Ma'ashi, putting constraints, you know, on your desires to eat more. But this is good for you, for this world and for the Akhirah, you know, at the same time. So like limiting your desire to make more money by prohibiting interest, you know, is this good for you or not? Of course, it's good for you, you know, and for the whole society. Same thing like drinking alcohol and other things. So all these constraints are good for you, and the benefit is defined from a broad perspective. We have an economist with us, you know, he specializes on the on this issue. Maybe Professor Hamul would like to comment on this as well. Muhammad Hojam, buyurun.
I think that if the question is that the deferral of pleasure for a greater pleasure is what Zuhd is about, I think that the scholars would not agree with that. I think the maqsad cannot be simply later, even in Jannah, for if you defer it, you get more pleasure. That is, the ayah is وَمَا لِأَحَدٍ عِنْدَهُ مِنْ نِعْمَةٍ تُجْزَى إِلَّا ابْتِغَاءَ وَجْهِ رَبِّهِ الْأَعْلَى. The maqsood has to be the acceptance and pleasure of Allah Ta'ala, not the greater deferral pleasure. That's why utilitarianism cannot be simply ukhrawi and be limited to that.
This is a higher level of answer. Not the answer of economics. This is meta-economics. But also there is a pleasure in gaining pleasure of Allah Ta'ala. You know, so you may also think it as a benefit, a greater, a higher benefit. Actually, human beings are not satisfied with animalistic pleasures because we have soul, we have akal. You know, what gives pleasure to us are not bodily pleasures. You know, like high-level pleasures, like zikrullah, you know, ma'rifatullah, knowing something, you know, learning something, discovering something. These are also like human pleasures above the level of animal pleasures. As Jesus said, man doesn't live on bread. You know, so it is not enough, you know, to just satisfy bodily desires. But materialistic approach focuses only on bodily needs. But the multiplex approach, your bodily needs, mental needs, and spiritual needs, you know, all of them should be satisfied. Bodily needs are not excluded, you know, and mental needs are not excluded, and spiritual needs at the same time. As I mentioned, like economics, politics, education, psychology, they are all built on the concept of human being. So if you think a human being is just body, like economics focuses only satisfying bodily needs, you know. But if you have this multiplex approach, then you try to provide multiple levels of the needs of human beings Same thing for education. Like, what is it that you will educate? And what are the psychological needs? Also political system, all of them is built on this human ontology. What's a human being? So the benefit is also defined this way.
May I read the quote from
yes, please.
Tashkotrizada?
Yes,
On
actually
Akhlaq.
he lived here.
Really?
You're
okay.
in his place.
So he may have said this quote. وأما رداءة الكيفية في العفة كمن ترك اللذة الشهوية ويقصد اعتياضا أكثر منها في الآخرة. This is what we're saying.
Yes.
أو في الحياة الدنيا كما ترى بعض المتعففين يعتزلون الناس بالكلية ويعرضون عما يحفظ بها بقاء الشخص والنوع من متاع الدنيا وحطامها لا للتوجه إلى جانب القدس وحضرة الجبروت ولا لابتغاء مرضاة الرب بل طلبا لمثله في الآخرة فهم في الحقيقة أحرص الناس وأطمعهم. This is Tashka Frizada. He says those who forego a pleasure so that they can get a greater pleasure in even later or even in the hereafter, and not for the sake of nearness to Allah Ta'ala, the acceptance, the pleasure of Allah Ta'ala, these are the most attached. أحرص الناس وأطمعهم, and the most greedy.
So this is Karama from Tashkent, because he lived here and probably he stayed in this room. We don't know, So this answer directly coming from him. Rahmatullahi alayh.
So this is Tashko Frizada on utilitarianism.
My question goes to Andar and Rahmi Ojaz. So, concerning this idea of incontrovertible truth, does it correspond to the classical understanding, logical understanding of the sixth mother of Yakini premises? Because you spoke of only Awaliyat, but I think it's not limited to Awaliyat. Second of all, I lost you. Why is it about incontrovertible truth? Because I would imagine that contemporary argumentation theory would be about questions of truth, good and bad. But in the classical logic, these are not issues of incontrovertible truth. These are the different epistemological criteria, usually mashurat or other categories. Thank you.
I want to understand you better.
Why the questions about incontrovertible truth? Because I would expect contemporary debates to be more about what is just, what is good, and these are not the issues of logic in the classical system. Because in classical logic, good and justice is the issues of a different category, not the issue of
I understand.
Just very small, and you can continue. If you look at 19th century discussions, the scholars, maybe philosophers, just thought of incontrovertible truth as the only makbul knowledge. Like, how do you translate makbul? And acceptable knowledge. And all the other syllogisms, despite the fact that Aristotle was not that reductionist. So it's very funny. Toulmin, in his book, the preface in 2008, says that even I was kind of excommunicated from my own community in my university. His teachers, the former logicians, was looking down on him because he was actually saying that Aristotle was actually bringing together dialectics, logics, and rhetorics together in his way of understanding of, how do you say, knowledge in general, acceptable knowledge, acceptable arguments. But in the 19th century, they go to that far that only the formalistic and formal syllogisms or burhan becomes the only acceptable knowledge, and all the rest are somehow discarded from the legitimate, how do you say, domain of argumentation. And then in 1950s, these two groups and rhetoricians knew, that's why it's called new rhetorics and new dialectics. They reclaimed other human faculties from rhetorical school and dialectical school, and they say, why don't we integrate also those like contextual, let's say, because if you look at formal logics, there's no context there. But in our actual argumentation, we are here and now, we try to convince each other. Anyway, so this is what, along with incontrovertible truth, there are other syllogisms that are acceptable. This is what, and it seems Muslim scholars knew this. And the funny thing is, so in 2019, there's a nice book from Greco and Rigotti, argumentation book. And there's a chapter on history of argumentation. There is no mentioning of any Muslim scholars. And they start from Aristotle, and then they jump this 1,000 years of hundreds of books on argumentation. And these guys actually know all these rhetorics, dialectics, and they had an answer to these questions. But finally, they just jump from Aristotle to the formal logic and informal logic, and then they move on to new dialectics and new rhetorics. So this is the thing, and we are here trying to say that this Munazara tradition actually has a different outlook to the same exact difficult problem of truth in argumentation. Is it? Yeah.
Tamam, we are running out of time, so thank you very much for your questions. Yeah? Yeah? No.
Maybe we can just say hello to him.
Oh, Tam, Professor Abdullah, do you have anything like to add? Is he here? I mean, here means like in a virtually here. Okay.
Professor Rothman, we thank you very much. Is there anything you would like to add?
Oh, Jazakallah khair. Thank you. No, I'm.
Okay.
I know we're short on time, so.
Okay, thank you. We are concluding this session, and thank you very much for your participation. We are very sorry that those Brits, they did not allow you to come over here.
Yeah.
But, inshallah, soon we'll have like other occasions to host you in Istanbul.
I would very much look forward to that, inshallah. Thank you so much.
We felt very sorry that you couldn't make it, but inshallah, we'll meet in Istanbul soon, inshallah, and other occasions. Okay, thank you very much, and give our salam and regards to our friends in CMC.
Will do. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, thank you very much. So we will have 15 minutes break, and the